Okay, hi everyone. I'm just going to talk a little bit about Sean Lemass today. I'm going to be reading from this book, Great Irish Speeches by Richard Aldous. He was a lecturer of mine in college. So I'm just going to read you a little bit about what he says about Sean Lemass. He talks about how the 1950s was a bleak decade for Ireland. Most of Western Europe had seen post-war austerity give way to an age of affluence. And this is a little bit what we have talked about already in class, about how the rest of Europe was able to see a post-war boom, but that did not occur for Ireland. The cost of living, unemployment and emigration figures were all sky high. Again, this links back to what we've already talked about. Some 40,000 people a year were leaving the country. So remember those figures we talked about yesterday for the decade of the 1950s. So just to break that down into an annual basis. The 1955 census showed the population of the Republic at its lowest level. So yesterday I talked about, in the first programme of economic expansion lecture that I went to with Dermot Fairter, he talked about how there was population shrinkage, and T.K. Whitaker and Sean Lemass were trying to combat that and to create an Ireland where people were willing to stay. So the census in 1955, those figures back that up. This was not merely an economic crisis, but one of national confidence. So this was something that was the government was to blame for. No one could blame this situation on the British. Protesters were marching through the streets of Dublin. The country's leaders showed little sense of knowing how to stop the downward spiral. 3 different governments had been elected between 1948 and 1954. Each one seemed worse than the last. Okay, so that backs up all our ideas about political instability. In 1955, with Fianna Fáil out of office, Sean Lemass began searching for a big idea to shake up the economy. Lemass was a pragmatic nationalist. Okay, so he was pragmatic, he was realistic. So he was stepping away from all those post-rising Civil War politics. As Minister for Industry and Commerce in the 1930s, okay, so remember during the emergency he was the Minister for Supplies. He had shielded the Irish economy behind a raft of tariff barriers, okay, so protectionism. Now he concluded this policy, which had been economic orthodoxy, was failing Ireland. Okay, so while it was effective in the 1930s and during the emergency, it was not effective now. It wasn't putting Ireland in a position to compete on a European level. To find a way forward, he studied European examples of economic planning, particularly Italy's 10-year employment and income scheme, the Vanoli plan. Okay, so this is something that we haven't looked at before, but it's worth just having a nod to it. And consulted progressive public servants such as Todd Andrews and Ken Whitaker. Okay, so T.K. Whitaker. When Lemass presented his own plan to Fianna Fáil, it led to dramatic clashes with colleagues. Okay, so that's interesting that it wasn't initially taken very well, and we talked a little bit about this in class way back when we were talking about Sean Lemass and how people were worried about removing protectionism, using state funds to attract foreign business, using taxpayers' money to fund businesses, and some members of the party had problems with that, and we've mentioned that already excuse me, when we were talking about this in class, so you can flick back through that PowerPoint to have a look at that slide. So on the 11th of October 1955, he gambled by making his ideas public at a party meeting at Cleary's Ballroom in Dublin. Okay, so Cleary's, you guys probably know it as that store on O'Connell Street with the clock, but it was quite a famous landmark at the time in the 1950s. The speech, published afterwards as a 4-page supplement in the Irish press, Lemass's promised to create 100,000 jobs in 5 years. Okay, so the targets of the first programme of economic expansion were high. And it was, I suppose, a motive to try and encourage people to step on board and to look at a new way of solving the economic problem. By the time the Costello government collapsed in early 1957, so the second inter-party government, Fianna Fáil, despite its initial caution, had adopted what became known as the Cleary's Agenda, and we'll now know it as the first programme of economic expansion. The party swept home at a general election, fought on economic issues, so they fought the next election promising economic change, economic development, jobs, creating an Ireland where people could stay. Okay, so remember that Fianna Fáil would traditionally have a conservative voting base, so they were targeting the parents of people, or parents who wanted an Ireland where their children could stay, so they weren't basically raising children for export. I mentioned that yesterday when I talked about some of the notes from that Ferreter lecture. So in 1958, Lemass launched the first programme of economic development. Okay, so what started as his presentation in the Cleary's ballroom, what became the Cleary's agenda, then when they were fighting the general election, then became the first programme of economic expansion, and that's what we know it now as. The following year, he succeeded De Valera as Taoiseach. So De Valera steps away, he's going to fight an election to become president, and Lemass takes over as Taoiseach. Lemass's Cleary's address signalled one of the most important policy U-turns in the history of the state. It also offered an example of a speech that was seminal without even reaching the foothills, let alone the heights of oratorical eloquence. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through this speech in the next video.